Well, hi and welcome to Life Through a Rural Lens online. My name's Richard Hancock. Some of you will know me as the Rural Field Officer for Dorset, but photography has always been a passion of mine since my early teens. And before training for ministry, I went to art college and trained as a professional photographer and worked as a freelance and commercial photographer for about 5 or 6 years prior to going to theological college. And even though I still do some photography work for agencies and I sell photographs online through a website which you may have seen, my photography now is really still a passion, and I find it a great way to unwind and relax and to get away from the strains and stresses that ministry can have. And I know all of us are being encouraged to think about hobbies and things that we can do in a sense to bring a fuller life to us and a better sense of well-being. So I can thoroughly recommend photography. I have to say, through my 26 years of ministry, it's really helped to keep me grounded. And the very creative process of photography, taking the photograph, processing it either by hand or on computer and then printing it out, does mean that you actually get an end result. And one of the things we soon learn in ministry is that often we don't necessarily get to see the end results. We might be the plougher or the sower, and it may be our successors that actually, in a sense, get to see the harvest that we have sown. But at least with photography, you can follow that whole pattern through. Now, some of you may have joined me over last year, and we did do one this year for our Life Through a Rural Lens gatherings, and we've been to various locations. The last one was Lake Abbey, and that was before the lockdown. And even though we've been in lockdown, I've found that photography has been really helpful, because though originally we weren't able to sort of drive to locations, I have found simply stepping out from the vicarage front door with a camera and getting out on some of the local footpaths around my own parish has been really eye-opening, because often we don't really get to explore the area that we live in. We so often jump in a car and drive to other places, but at least now we can go a little bit further afield. So welcome to all of those who have joined me before on our actual photography exhibitions, and to any of you who are new to Life Through a Rural Lens and these photography courses, and I hope you enjoy them. Now, one of the things I have to take into account is, of course, we have people here of all mixed abilities. I know some of you will be very accomplished photographers, amateurs, or even semi-professionals producing a very high quality standard of work, and that's great. And I know others of you will be really new to photography. So I'm going to come in a sense as if we're all sort of new to photography. It always helps to have a bit of a reminder sometimes. So apologies to those who maybe are very familiar with photographic techniques. A lot of this video might not be particularly relevant to you, so do feel free to skip it and then join in the Zoom discussion that we're going to have a bit later on, which will be live, and Louise will be sending out the links to that in due course. But what I want to cover today is basically what camera should I use, and some of the basic camera techniques and camera controls, and then a little bit about composition and some of the rules that we can bring into bear to improve our photography. And the idea when we were thinking about doing an online course was for each of you to come up with your own particular project. And really what we'd like you to do is produce a set of photographs, between 6 to 10 photographs, no more than that, on a particular subject or theme that may be of interest to you, or you can do within the context or location that you're in. So you might want to photograph aspects of lockdown in your own parish. You can still do portraiture, because you can take portrait photographs of people standing 2 meters away without any problem. You might want to do some portrait photography of people outside in your communities. You might want to do wildlife or landscape, or if you're based in one of our towns within the diocese, you might want to do a little bit of street or architectural photography if you go on your daily walks. But please remember, if you are out and about, do remember social distancing. And I tend to wear a mask now if I'm going out and about, not so much to protect me, but really just to protect others in case I've got a bit of a cough. So we can all enjoy photography in this way. So let's just have a think about cameras. Now, I do have a lot of cameras. I collect vintage cameras, most of which still work, and I do have modern gear too. But I'm not a gear geek, to be honest with you. At the end of the day, a camera is simply a tool for catching an image. And it doesn't matter whether you have a camera that's worth 50 quid or a camera that's worth £2,500, it's not necessarily going to help you take better pictures. Good photography is about understanding light and composition. The camera is simply a tool to help you do that. Now, yes, some of the more expensive cameras, if you are into specific types of photography, like you're into sports photography and you need very fast shutter speeds, or if you're into wildlife photography and you need very large, powerful zoom lenses, you are going to need some special. Vast majority of photography, you can enjoy it without spending huge amounts of money. And indeed, as I said, quite a lot of the cameras I've found which are take out with me on a day, I put a roll of film in, and I've picked these up in charity shops and sort of bargain shops around Salisbury, and they've cost me 10 or 20 quid, and they take great photographs. So please don't feel that you have to go out and spend a lot of money. It's best to sort of learn the basics and start there, and then invest in more serious kit as you decide to hone in on particular projects. So let's just have a look at the type of cameras that people may have. First of all, your mobile phone. If you have a smartphone, the image quality that you can now get from phones is quite incredible. And my iPhone 6 here is really quite ancient, but it still takes really great photographs, and I have it in my pocket all the time. I can post things up to Instagram. Yeah, fair enough. If I see a very interesting bird in a tree a huge distance away, this is not going to capture it. But I can capture scenes in black and white and colour. I can capture flora and fauna. I can do portraits with this. I can do some landscape. I can do architecture with this. And you can get some fantastic images. And what's more is you can actually edit them in your phone as you go. So, you know, I know as I look at lots of online photography courses and YouTube channels and everything, some photographers can get very snobby about the phone. At the end of the day, it captures an image, and as a photographer, all we're interested in is capturing images. So anything that can capture an image can be useful, and the fact that you can pop one of these in your pocket and have it with you all the time is a really interesting thing. There's some great photographers on Instagram who only use a mobile phone, and they do some amazing photography as they go around. Even highly well-known professional photographers who are part of what we would call the elite Magnum photographers. If you've ever heard of a Magnum photographic agency, it's quite a prestigious thing to belong to. I know several Magnum photographers who wouldn't go anywhere without their mobile phone and take pictures and post them onto Instagram. So it's worth having a look at the work that they do. And also with more modern smartphones, you've got a lot more control in the image. It's not just taking the picture. Like some of the more expensive, more traditional cameras, you can do things with shutter speeds, depth of field and other effects, which I'll come to on another time. So for the moment, if you don't have a proper camera as such, and you've got one of these, then you're fine. You can join in with this course and you're going to have a lot of fun. Now the next step up is some of you will have something like this. In fact, this was just recently given to me by a parishioner who really isn't using it anymore, and they actually felt it was a bit too complicated. I'm not surprised. That is the guidebook that comes with it. But I've kept this camera because I've been running a photographic course for our local scouts to get their scout badge, and this hopefully is a camera that they can use. And this in a sense is your compact digital camera. If I switch it on, it has a built-in zoom lens from 25 to 250 millimeters. This one's got a screen on the back and even a little viewfinder, and it has all of the sort of settings I would expect to see on a camera, from being able to use this camera completely automatically, just to set it on a dial, and then its little computer brain will virtually do everything for you, through to aperture priority, shutter priority, and even I can use this fully manual. And of course a camera like this will also take videos as well. And many of these modern compact cameras too will link to your iPhone or your laptop via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, so you can post pictures up onto the internet very, very quickly. I also know a lot of professional photographers, street photographers, who opt to use these kind of cameras simply because they're very easy to keep in your pocket, and they're just sort of they're very unassuming. If you walk around with a huge camera and a big lens and you then start pointing at people in the streets, they can be highly suspicious of you, and rightly so. But if you've got a little camera like this, you're not doing a lot of harm, and you can capture a lot of fantastic images with you. And also, you know, one of the rules, golden rules, I think, of getting into photography seriously is never leave home without a camera. That, as I say, is the advantage of smartphones. But I have to say, though I do have my smartphone on me, I have, not this one, but I have a Fuji version camera that I keep with me at all times. It's a smaller compact camera, and it comes with me in my sort of man bag wherever I go. But these are great cameras, and you can pick up something like this for around about £100 or just over, or some of them are much more expensive. This is quite an expensive one, I believe. But again, if you've got a compact digital camera like this, you're going to have a huge fun time with photography. And the wonderful built-in zoom lens here as well just about covers most things that you would want to do. So if you've got something like that, then that's a great camera. Now, some of you would have got some more expensive kit. This is my main digital camera. It's a Fujifilm X Pro 3. It's what they call a rangefinder camera design. As you can see up here, instead of like what we call an SLR camera, where you sort of the viewfinder is at the top and you're looking through the lens, what you have here is this rangefinder which is set to the side of the camera. It's a design that people often think is copied from Leica, which is true, but Fuji has been making rangefinder style cameras since I think about the 1960s, so it's not an unfamiliar design. But this camera is a digital camera, though you can't see the back. There is a screen here, and it gives you the best of both worlds, because I can use an optical viewfinder here, and if I want to, by pressing a button, I can actually see the image through the lens. And yes, the menu on this camera is never ending, but I very rarely use it, I have to say. I often think with cameras that it's interesting that, you know, people get worried about taking pictures what they call manually, that is going to be really difficult. But actually isn't, because when you take pictures manually, you've only got three things to worry about, which is your shutter speed, your aperture, and in a sense your film speed or light sensitivity of your sensor. I find some of the program menus in these sorts of cameras, where you can set it for wildlife or whatever, very, very complicated, and to be honest with you, I very, very rarely use them. And I'm going to explain the simpler settings in cameras that you can sort of stick with and learn a lot. The advantage of these larger cameras is that most of them have interchangeable lenses, so that you can, in a sense, build up a set of lenses for the different sorts of photography that you do. However, don't buy lenses just for the sake of buying lenses. I don't tend to have any very large telephoto lenses, because I don't tend to do wildlife photography. It's never really been my thing, so I don't need very powerful long lenses. And again, I do find some photographers think that unless they've got something that's this size coming out of their camera, they're somehow not proper and correct. The lot of the photography I do tends to be landscape photography and street photography and what they might call a reportage photography. I like to do projects like that. So one of the projects I've been working on for several years now is what I call Beside the Seaside, and I love to photograph traditional British seaside towns, that slightly faded glory that they have and the people that you see within them, and you can see some of those pictures on my website. So the advantage of having a camera like this is you can then buy sets of lenses that are particularly useful to the style of photography that you have. Now, some of you might not have gone digital, or you may have gone digital and then decided to go back to film. Film has had a wonderful resurgence, and that's largely thanks to photography students at university and college, because there's still a requirement for them to learn how to photograph on film, process film, and print film by hand, print images by hand. Film has not died out, and in fact film sales over the past 10 years or so have increased year on year on, and that's even resulted in some companies like Fuji and Kodak actually issuing and developing new types of colour film, and companies like Ilford, who specialise in black and white film, developing new black and white films. So there's a whole plethora of films that are available there. You can pick them up at your camera shops if they were open. If you live anywhere near Salisbury, we have two great camera shops in Salisbury. We've got London Camera Exchange and Castle Cameras, and they can supply you with film. If not, just go online. You can buy film via Amazon or eBay, or directly from places like Ilford. And processing it is fairly easy too. Even though a lot of our laboratories are, the door is shut, you can give them a ring and they will send you a little plastic bag which you can send your films off in the post, and they will process them for you. Unless of course you want to have a go at developing them by hand. There's a lot of mystique about developing pictures by hand, but I develop all my own black and white, all my own colour films, and all my own slide film, and it's not a very difficult thing to do once you've got the chemicals. And later on I will do a video about having a go at developing your own films at home. But some of you might have old film cameras knocking around. So for example, this fantastic camera here, which is an Olympus OM1, comes from the late 60s. I had one of these when I worked as a professional photographer. In fact, Olympus 35mm cameras were my workhorse. This isn't the one I had because I wore it out, but this was a second-hand one I bought in a shop in Salisbury. I think it cost me about £35, and it takes fantastic pictures. Came with a 50mm lens, everything is fine on it. The light meter even works on it, though I've had to do a little bit of modification on the battery compartment to get that going. So if you've got an old film camera around your home that used to be yours, then check it out. Providing it all seems to work, get a roll of film and see that, so you don't have to go out and invest in a digital camera. And I have to say, I started a new project last year which was black and white landscapes, which you'll see again on my website, and I think you'll receive a link to that. And that is all film. I'm using 35mm film cameras and what they call medium format cameras that have bigger negatives. And that's a project I've set myself deliberately on film because it just helps hone your skills in a particularly different way. So this is what tended to be called a SLR camera, and that was because, again, if I just quickly take the lens off here, through the lens reflex camera, you can see there's a little mirror there. You look through the viewfinder here, 45-degree angle, and it means you can see what you can see through the lens. These cameras are going up in value, and that's because the students that really have helped resurrect photography, and now keen amateurs and professionals are going back to using film, are buying these up, because there's not many companies now that make new film cameras, and the ones that do, like Leica, will cost you a lot of money. And finally, speaking of Leica, some of you might be lucky enough to own one of these. This is a Leica M6. This one was produced late 2000s, but the M6 went back to the very early 80s. It's what's known as a rangefinder camera, again, a bit like the digital one I've shown you. You look through this side window here, and you have to line up a patch, and when it's all lined up, everything is in focus. This is a 35mm camera. It's a beautiful camera to use, and these are collector's items, and they go up in value, but they're not cheap. It has to be said, but you won't lose any money on these if you look after them, because their real resale value goes up constantly. But lovely camera to use in its film, and I still use that an awful lot. So regardless of whether you've got something like this, or lovely Leica, or you know, all whistles and bangs digital camera, it doesn't matter. You can enjoy photography as long as you can capture an image. So don't feel you have to go out and spend a lot of money to engage with this, but as you develop your interest, you then might want to buy some more kit. So whether you're using film or digital, everything I'm going to share with you now applies to both cameras, because the essence of capturing an image is exactly the same in digital as it is in film. The principles are the same, and for this I'm just going to use my Leica camera here. Now basically photography is about capturing light, and in order to capture light you need to be able to control light. And the three elements that all cameras use to do that is your shutter speed, and that, as it says, is whether it's a curtain or a blade at the back of the camera that opens and closes at a set speed to allow light in. And obviously the faster the shutter speed that you have, the less light that comes in. The slower the shutter speed, the longer it's open, the more light comes in. And so, for example, on a very bright sunny day, you need a fast shutter speed in order to have a correct exposure. However, if you're taking photographs in the early morning at dawn, or at dusk, you can try and get some nice low light photography, you will need a slow shutter speed. Now, different cameras have shutter speed controls in different places. Now, on sort of fairly traditional cameras, there is either a dial at the top. I have a dial here that gives me shutter speed from 1 second to 1,000 plus B, which means I can hold it open. Some cameras have the shutter speed dial round the neck of the lens, like Olympus, and some of the sort of smaller digital cameras, and even your mobile phones, on the menus that you get, you will find some way that you can manually set your shutter speed if you wish. The other thing to bear in mind with shutter speed is what is known as camera shake. Now, depending how steady your hand is, will determine whether or not you're able to hold a camera to take a photograph. But the rule of thumb is if you've got a standard sized lens on your camera, not a big telephoto lens, but a standard sized lens, something like a 50mm or 35mm, you can hand hold your camera and take photographs with a shutter speed as low as 1/30th of a second. If you go below that, what will happen when you look at your images, they will seem to be a bit blurred, because even though you think you're holding the camera steady, what is happening is that it's just moving a little bit, and you'll end up with a blurred image. The longer the lens, if you have big telephoto lenses on, you have to up your shutter speed, because it's a much narrower angle of view, so it amplifies any movement in the camera. The easy way round this is twofold, is either to have a higher film rating or ISO, light sensitivity, so if you up that, then you can have a higher shutter speed, or in a sense the mechanical way, buy yourself a tripod. And even with mobile phones, you can get little tripods to hold them, which will help with this. So a tripod is a useful bit of kit for photographers to have. I should say that you would have been emailed out these sheets, which are here, and this explains everything about shutter speeds, aperture and ISO, which I'm explaining to you now, so do feel free to have a look at these. So the next way that we control light is through the aperture of a lens, and basically all lenses have a sort of a diaphragm in with a hole that opens and closes. The bigger the hole, the more light that comes in. The smaller the hole, the less light that comes in. Now it's slightly counterintuitive because these lenses have numbers on the top. They're called f-stops, which determines the size of that hole. Now, as I say, it's slightly counterintuitive because the smaller the number, so this camera goes down to f.1, the bigger the hole will be. The bigger the number, this camera goes right up to f16, the smaller the hole will be. So it's sort of slightly back to front, and it can take a little bit of time to remind us of that. Now if I carefully take this lens off and just hold it up there, you can see the diaphragm there, and if I just turn that, hopefully you can just see that there opening up, and there it is closing down. That is what is controlling the light in a camera. So that is your aperture. Put this back on. And a combination of your aperture and your shutter speed will determine correct exposure. Now the other thing with aperture, as I said, with shutter speed, that can help control things. So if you're doing sports photography, for example, you'll need a fast shutter speed because you want to freeze the action. If you're doing landscape photography and you want to get those nice sort of seascapes with misty water and things like that, you're going to want a slow shutter speed. So you can control the image through that. Now, aperture, as well as controlling light, on cameras like this, unfortunately not on mobile phones and also with some very small compact cameras, but on sort of larger cameras, it does control what's known as depth of field. And depth of field basically means how much of the image is in focus in front of the subject and how much of the image is in focus behind the subject. Now, for example, the little lens that's on this camera, on this computer, is a very wide angle lens. So you're looking at me and really everything in front and behind is all in focus, and that's one of the advantages of a very wide angle lens. And that's why the sorts of lenses you find on mobile phones and such like, it's very difficult to control aperture. But just say I'm wanting to do a portrait of me sitting here, and as you can see, my study behind me is quite cluttered, and that can be make the eye wander around in the picture. If I want what's behind me out of focus, when I was taking a portrait, I would use a low aperture. So in other words, I'd make sure the hole was wide open, something like 1.4 or f2. Now that would mean that my face would be in focus because I'd sort of focus on the eyes, never focus on the nose because, and that's the trouble with autofocus cameras, they will focus on the nearest thing, which will be your nose, which means that people's eyes will be out of focus. So always try and focus on the eyes. A lot of modern cameras have what's called eye detect. If you switch that on, the camera will detect the eyes and focus on those rather than people's noses or chins. But as I say, if you have the camera set, your camera lens set to f1 or f2, it will mean that my face will be in focus, but the background will be slightly blurred. And some lenses are absolutely fabulous at that, particularly outside, and you get a wonderful thing, what they call bokeh, which is this sort of out of focus, sort of pastel-y effect in an image. However, if you're doing a bit of a landscape shot, or say you're photographing your church and you want to make sure the church is in focus and all of the foreground and the background, you need to make sure you've got a small aperture. So you need to make sure that hole is small, and that will result in everything being in focus in front and behind the image. So you'd put it onto about something like f16. The wonderful thing about digital cameras as opposed to film is, of course, you can play around with these techniques. It's quite difficult to see the results on the screen at the back of a camera, but if you practice, choose a subject like your church or a tree or something, and just adjust the aperture, and then put the pictures up on a computer and look at the different effects, and you will see how the focus follows through. Now, the final way that, as I say, you control light is what they call your ISO. And years ago, when you used to have film, you probably remember you would buy a canister of film, and on the film it would have a number like 50 or 100, 200, 400, 3200, and that was how sensitive the emulsion on the film was to light. The same is true with digital cameras. The sensitivity of the digital sensor can be altered by adjusting the ISO. To be honest with you, most people tend to keep that on automatic, and a lot of the time I have to say I have my ISO on my digital camera set to automatic, even though in the menu setting I have specified that it will be no lower than 100 ISO and no higher than 800 ISO. And that's a really good way to start. Later on, as you learn to control ISO and its different advantages, you might want to do it manually. But the rule of thumb with ISO is, again, the higher the number, the more sensitive to light it will be. The lower, the less sensitive to light it will be. So on a bright sunny day, like it is outside, shooting at 100 or 200 ISO will be fine. If I go much beyond that, my shutter speeds won't cope. They'll be so high that the camera won't cope, and you'll have out of focus shots. But if you're photographing at dusk or dawn, having an ISO of 400 or 800 will allow you to get a higher shutter speed, so you'll probably be able to hold the camera. And of course, don't forget, as you reduce that hole, that reduces the amount of light that comes through, and that will also affect your shutter speed. I know it's all starting to sound quite complicated, but it's on the sheets here. But I'm going to let you into the secret. So there is a thing called sunny 16ths, and some of you who maybe used film cameras many years ago might remember this rule. And this is where you don't have to worry about any settings at all. You just set them from the outset and then you leave them and this is completely manual. So basically the rule is if you put a film in your camera that is say 100 ISO, you then dial your lens down to f16. That's why it's called sunny 16. It needs to be a bright sunny day. So you put it f16, 100 ISO. You then choose the shutter speed that is nearest to that ISO setting. So 100 ISO, the nearest shutter speed is 125th of a second. If you put a 200 film in or 200 ISO, then use 250th of a second. And on the whole, that will mean that you will get reasonably exposed pictures that you can then adjust later on your computer. Now, the other thing that camera manufacturers wax lyrical about is autofocus and autofocus speed, and they all sort of, if you read reviews of cameras, they all talk about their camera's got the fastest autofocus speed that there is. And that's great. I mean, it does simplify things a lot. But my very old Leica here, that's 20 odd years old, it doesn't have autofocus on it at all. The focus on this lens is completely manual. So it does mean that if I want to take a picture, I have to put it up here, I have to sort of adjust this little wheel here, line things up and take the picture. That can take a bit of time. But very famous street photographers, Magnum photographers, Cartier-Bresson, a very famous French photographer, have used these kind of cameras for years, and they have captured some of the most amazing street scenes. And that's because they don't bother to focus their camera, or they pre-focus their camera. Up on the top of a lens, all of these odd sort of little numbers are what allow you to do that. They're marked off in feet and meters. So when I'm using this film camera and I don't want to be bothered focusing it, what you do is you sort of set your focal distance. So these numbers have the aperture on them. So I tend to like to shoot at f8. That's gives me a reasonable amount of focus behind and in front of the subject, but then blurs out anything that's in the distance. And then all I do is there's a sort of upside down 8 on here, which symbolises infinity. I move that to the bit of the lens that says f8, and I now know that my camera will take a sharp picture of anything that is within 2 meters of me and infinity. Perfect for lockdown, because if I get closer to anybody than 2 meters, the picture will be out of focus. So it's almost like a sort of lockdown setting. Now the camera's on that setting, I don't have to worry about focusing the camera anymore. So to make my life even easier, I then just have a light meter reading, or I know that actually at f8 with a 100 ISO film in here, I need to, on a sort of brightish sunny day, I need to set my shutter speed to about 250th of a second or 500th of a second. And that's it. I never have to touch my shutter speed, my aperture, or my focus at all. And I can go out and take pictures all day. The only thing I have to do with this film camera is crank the handle and press the shutter button. And then when I get back and process the film, virtually all of those pictures will be reasonably enough exposed. There might be some that are a little bit bright or a little bit dark, and all of them will be in focus because I've learned roughly, it's very good, we're all learning what 2 meters away is. I know how far 2 meters away is, and then everything after that is in focus. So I can just quickly go around, click, click, click. I don't have to touch or worry about any of the settings, and that's photographing completely manual, which lots of people get really worried about. But once you've got it set up, you don't have to do anything else. With my digital camera, I find I'm constantly having to press buttons and such like. But thankfully with some of these cameras you can shoot completely manual as well, and you can do that even with a digital camera. So I'm sorry if that seems quite long and fluted, but do read the sheet and do experiment with your shutter speed, with your aperture and with your ISO. They're the 3 things that control the camera. Now, if you're worried about controlling all of those and you're not just going to set it up like I did there, then my suggestion is to either shoot with the camera on what they would call program mode, P mode, in your camera. That means that the camera, if it's a modern camera, the camera's processor will decide the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO for you, so you just have to worry about clicking the button, and of course if it's an autofocus camera, the camera will do that for you. So you can just worry about composing the picture, and there is no shame in that at all. There's a t-shirt going around that somebody wanted to buy me, and I said absolutely not, and the t-shirt says everybody's a photographer until, and it's got a dial with M, sort of somehow suggesting that if you photograph, if you take photographs using your camera completely manually, then you're a far more accomplished photographer than everybody else. Absolute hogwash. I was watching a wonderful video the other day about a fantastic Magnum street photographer, and he uses his camera on what is called aperture priority, and that's my favourite priority. Now basically that is on your dial at the top, my little compact camera here, it has it, there is an A, and it basically means I turn it to an A. That will mean that the camera will decide what the shutter speed is. But it does mean then I can adjust the aperture, and the aperture is the thing that gives you the most creative control in most photography, like portrait and landscape photography. Sport photography, you would want it the other way around. But it then means I can adjust the aperture and the camera will sort out the correct shutter speed. So if you feel a little bit more confident and you don't want to just use the camera on completely automatic, learn how to use your camera and put it on aperture priority and learn to play with your aperture. But do remember, if the shutter speed gets very, very low, the camera will just choose a low shutter speed, you will get camera shake. So it's worth looking at the information on the back of the camera and seeing that if your shutter speed, it will be displayed there, if it's dropped below that 1/30th of a second, you may well need to either increase the ISO in your menu setting, put it up from 100 to 400 or 800, or you're going to have to use a tripod. So do try aperture priority. I have to say probably, unless I'm using a film camera and I'm sort of doing that technique where I set everything up in advance, when I'm using my digital cameras, I reckon 95% of the time I'm shooting in aperture priority, and I know a lot of professional photographers that is their choice too, is aperture priority. So that explains the sort of basic controls of the camera. And when we have our Zoom meeting, if you want to ask me any questions and we want to discuss that, then we can do that as well. Now, moving on to what I think is actually the most important part of photography. That's why, if you want to, just leave your camera on P and let it do everything for you. There's no shame in that, because the most important part of photography is, oh, sorry, it's very bright in here, is your composition. And this is the other sheet that has been emailed out to you. It's a PDF. Now, some of you will know about this, and it's what's called the rule of thirds. So if you imagine like this screen is like your viewfinder, if you imagine you've drawn like a noughts and crosses grid of 9 squares on there, you will end up with a set of lines like that. The lines that intersect going vertically and horizontally are known as the lines of thirds. And it's very, very simple. Our natural instinct when we take a photograph, a bit like I am now, is to have the subject right in the centre of view. And certainly there are a lot of times when that works well. But actually, composition, and if you look at great artists and everything, what we're trying to do is turn a 2-dimensional image into something that's more 3-dimensional. So by simply moving to on the third line, so I'm now on the line of thirds, it just makes the picture a little bit more interesting. Your eye is being drawn to me to begin with now because I'm sort of in the foreground, but then you're moving out to my old photographic lamp in the background, and it's just giving it a sense of depth. So, and you can do that sort of on the vertical lines by putting your subject on either side, or the horizontal lines. So for example, if you're taking a seascape or a landscape, think about how much sky you're going to have, put the sky line on the line of thirds, or drop it right down to the bottom if you want lots of sky, or the other way round. And it's just a simple little tip. So do practice that, have a go at the rule of thirds, and if you're not familiar with that technique, many of you will be, you will probably suddenly look at your photographs and go, wow, just doing that has made a huge improvement. So really get to grips with the rule of thirds. The other thing, as I said, you're trying to make the image, what is a 2-dimensional image, have a sort of 3-dimensional effect. So as well as rule of thirds, it's useful to have things that help lead your eye in to the picture. Obviously with a portrait you want to get as close as you can, head and shoulders you might go for, unless you're doing a portrait of say a craftsman who might be a blacksmith or a thatcher or something like that, then of course the portrait you are going to want to include in the subject the materials and the tools that are important to that person. But for example, if you're sort of doing landscape or street photography or something like that, if you can find lines, whether it's a path leading into the distance, a fence leading into the distance, a row of trees, lines on paving slabs, anything that just helps lead the eye into the photograph will help to give it that feel of depth. So if you apply your rule of thirds and make sure you've got something that helps to lead your eye in, that will also help. The final sort of tip is to maybe try and make sure that your pictures aren't too cluttered. Sometimes you want to do that deliberately for a particular effect, and in some forms of street photography, having a very cluttered image can actually be very interesting because you do want the eye to sort of scan around and look at everything. But actually, as you see, as I've mentioned, my office behind me is very, very cluttered, and it wouldn't make a particularly good portrait because I think people would be too busy looking at all the junk that I've got behind you. So when you come to frame and compose your image, just try and think of the elements that are in there and make sure that the image isn't too cluttered. You've used the rule of thirds, there's something to help lead your eye in, and you've made sure there's not something very distracting. That's why black and white can be so brilliant. It can be quite difficult black and white in the sense that you've got no colour there, but then you have no distractions, because sometimes there's nothing worse. I've done a landscape picture, I've set everything up, and the camera's on a tripod, and unbeknown to me, what's happened is moving into the frame has been somebody just in the distance on a hill wearing a red anorak. That means later on, if I don't remove that from the photograph, when anybody looks at that picture, their eye will immediately be drawn to that little red dot of somebody wearing an anorak. In black and white, they wouldn't have noticed it. So just be aware of other elements in the picture that might result in the eye being drawn where you don't want it to draw. So I think we'll leave it there for now. I've rabbited along. I hope that hasn't been too complicated. Please do read the sheets that have been emailed out, because they will help to explain shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and those techniques, as well as shooting in rule of thirds. And then get out and enjoy your camera. Practice some of the different techniques, experiment with the different techniques, and then while you're doing that, think about the project that you might like to do over the next few months. It's best to give yourself quite an amount of time to do projects. I've got about 3 projects on the go at the moment. One of my projects has been running for about 4 years, so to set yourself a project you're just going to do in a week probably won't go. So have a think about something that's going to really keep you focused on your photography, that might keep you going till the end of the year. And as I say, what we want to do is, it'd be really great if people can then produce 10 photographs. As I say, you don't have to do that in 2 weeks' time, but it'd be nice that in a few months' time, if you've been able to produce 6 to 10 pictures, either colour or black and white. I've got a page on my website that will be linked to the Diocesan website, and in a sense we'll have a bit of a virtual gallery of the work that we have done. Now, we will be having a Zoom meeting and you can ask questions there, but if you do want to send me an email just to ask me a specific question, then you can email me at canonrick, that's CANONRICK, at icloud.com, and just send me an email if you want some advice about photography or equipment or such like, and I'll do my best to answer those questions. So I look forward to meeting you all on our Zoom meeting and discussing some of the techniques and photography and thinking about the projects we will be doing in the future. In the meantime, it's Friday when I recorded this. Hope you get to get outside, enjoy your cameras, and take some pictures. Every blessing.